They laughed at the mountain man for buying an obese Amish bride. The whole town jeered as she climbed into his wagon, whispering that he was a fool, that she would be his ruin. But what they mocked that day would change the valley forever. In the shadow of the mountains, where church bells echo and wagon wheels grind on dust, this unlikely pair begins a life together. She's not just a cast-off widow, she carries hidden strength, a faith that can heal the sick, and a secret deed that could stop the railroad dead in its tracks. The same voices that laughed soon turn desperate, knocking at their door when hunger, fire, and sickness sweep the land. The woman they shamed holds the mercy they need to survive. But when power, greed, and betrayal rise up, one question remains. Will the mountain man and his bride stand strong enough to turn ridicule into redemption? Or will the valley fall to ruin? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. Luis Cade guided his wagon down the dusty road leading away from town, the summer evening air growing cooler as dusk settled over the Colorado foothills. The steady clip-clop of the horse's hooves and creak of wooden wheels filled the heavy silence between him and his new bride. Miriam Stoltzfus sat rigid beside him on the wagon seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her plain black bonnet pulled low. The mocking laughter from the auction square still seemed to hang in the air behind them. Luis could feel the tension in Miriam's posture, sensed the shame and fear radiating from her sturdy frame. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, giving her what privacy he could in this exposed moment. "Ain't far now," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "Another hour or so to the homestead." Miriam gave a slight nod, but remained silent. The lantern swaying from the wagon's front corner cast shifting shadows across her face. In its glow, Luis could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around her mouth, the way her shoulders slumped beneath her simple dress despite her efforts to sit straight. The scene at the auction square played over in his mind as they rode. He hadn't planned on attending, having come to town only for supplies. But word had spread quickly through the streets about the spectacle to come. A cast-out Amish widow being put up for auction like common livestock. The cruel excitement in people's voices had drawn him to the square, though he'd stood back in the shadows of the livery stable. When they'd brought Miriam out onto the wooden platform, a ripple of jeers had gone through the crowd. She'd stood there with quiet dignity, despite her obvious distress, clutching her prayer book and bonnet. The auctioneer had made a show of it, playing to the crowd's mood with exaggerated gestures. "What'll you give for a fine, strong woman, gents?" He'd called out. "Bit plain, perhaps, but stout enough for farm work. Comes from good Amish stock, knows her way around a kitchen and a barn." The laughter had grown louder, peppered with crude comments about her figure and dress. A few half-hearted joke bids were called out, met with more guffaws. Miriam had kept her eyes downcast, but Luis had seen her hands trembling. He wasn't sure what had made him step forward. Perhaps it was the memory of his own mother, widowed young and struggling to maintain her dignity in a harsh world. Or maybe it was simply that he couldn't bear to watch this quiet woman endure such mockery a moment longer. The crowd had fallen silent as he'd emerged from the shadows, his scarred face and reputation familiar enough to give them pause. Without ceremony, he'd pulled out his carefully hoarded gold and laid it on the auctioneer's table. "I'll take her," he'd said, voice carrying in the sudden quiet, "as my wife, proper and legal." The jeering had started again then, men calling him a fool for spending good money on such a plain, cast-off woman. But Luis had ignored them, extending his hand to help Miriam down from the platform. She'd taken it with surprising strength, though her fingers were cold against his calloused palm. Now, as they rode through the gathering dark, Luis snuck another glance at his unexpected bride. The lantern light caught the silver threads in her brown hair, neatly tucked under her bonnet. Though stout, there was a grace to her movements, a careful precision that spoke of someone used to hard work and attention to detail. "Got a proper house," he found himself saying, wanting to break the heavy silence. "Built it myself, 2 rooms and a good roof. Root cellar too, though it needs organizing something fierce." Miriam's hands tightened on her prayer book. "I am grateful," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight German lilt. "For your intervention, though I fear you have burdened yourself with a poor bargain." Louise shook his head. "No burden. Place needs a woman's touch, truth be told. Been too long just me out there." He paused, then added gruffly, "Reckon we can make it work well enough, if you're willing." She turned slightly toward him then, studying his profile in the dim light. "You are kind to say so, but I am not." She hesitated. "I am not what most men would want in a wife. My former family made that clear enough." The pain in her voice stirred something protective in Luis's chest. "Don't set much store by what other folks think is wanted," he said. "Way I see it, Lord puts people in our path for his own reasons. Ain't our place to question, just to do right by each other best we can." Miriam's breath caught slightly at his words. After a moment, she said quietly, "You speak like one who knows the good book." Luis's hands tightened on the reins, used to before the war. He left it at that, not ready to speak of the faith he'd lost in those dark years. They rode on in silence for a while, the wagon swaying gently over the rutted road. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage and pine from the nearby hills. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely song echoing across the valley. "There's quilts and blankets in the back," Louise said as Miriam pulled her shawl tighter. "Get cold up here, even in summer." She reached back and found a rough wool blanket, drawing it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she murmured. After a pause, she added, "I can cook and clean, tend gardens and livestock. I will earn my keep." "Ain't about earning keeps," Louise replied. "It's about building something. Together, maybe." He cleared his throat. "If you've a mind to try." Miriam was quiet for so long that Louise thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, voice barely above a whisper, "Yeah, I would like to try." The wagon crested a small rise, and Louise pointed ahead to where a cluster of buildings was barely visible in the gathering dark. "That's home," he said. "Not much to look at, but the land's good. Creek runs year-round and the soil's rich enough in the bottom field." Miriam leaned forward slightly, trying to make out the shapes in the darkness. The lantern light swung wildly as they began the descent, casting strange shadows across the landscape. Louise kept the horses steady on the slope, aware of Miriam's slight intake of breath at each bump and sway. "Easy now," he murmured, though whether to the horses or his new bride he wasn't quite sure. As they drew closer, details emerged from the darkness. A solid log house stood in the center of the clearing, its windows dark but promising shelter. A barn loomed to one side, and various smaller outbuildings clustered nearby. A split rail fence marked out a kitchen garden, though it looked somewhat overgrown. Louise drew the wagon to a stop in front of the house. For a moment, neither of them moved, both staring at what would now be their shared home. Then Louise climbed down, coming around to help Miriam from her seat. She accepted his hand with the same quiet strength she'd shown at the auction, though he noticed she swayed slightly when her feet touched the ground. "Been a long day," he said, steadying her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "Let's get you inside and settled." He lifted their lantern high, illuminating the path to the front door. Miriam walked beside him, her steps determined, despite her obvious weariness. At the door, Louise paused, suddenly uncertain of the proper way to proceed, but Miriam surprised him by speaking first. "Before we enter," she said softly, "I would ask, what are your expectations of me, as your wife?" Louise turned to face her fully, making sure she could see his expression in the lantern light. "Expect you to be yourself," he said simply. "Nothing more, nothing less. We'll figure out the rest as we go along." Miriam's eyes, when they met his, held a mix of wariness and hope that made his heart ache. "And you will be patient while we figure things out?" "Reckon I've learned a thing or two about patience," he replied. "Got all the time in the world to get things right." The tension in her shoulders eased slightly and she nodded. "Then, I'm ready to begin." The wagon creaked and swayed as Louise guided the horses up into the foothills. Evening shadows stretched long across the trail, and the air grew cooler with each foot of elevation they gained. Miriam sat rigid beside him, her silence as heavy as the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Luis knew these trails well enough to navigate them in the dying light. The horses picked their way carefully over rocks and around sharp turns, their hooves sending loose pebbles skittering down the slope. Each bump and dip made the wagon jolt, and he noticed how Miriam gripped the seat's edge, though she never complained. After about an hour of slow climbing, the sound of running water reached them. Luis steered the wagon toward a small clearing he often used when traveling this route. A creek tumbled nearby, its voice a constant whisper in the growing dark. "We'll stop here for the night," he said, drawing the horses to a halt. "Creek's good for water, and there's grass enough for the horses." Miriam nodded but didn't speak. She remained on the wagon seat while Luis jumped down and began setting up camp with practiced efficiency. He unhitched the horses, rubbing them down before securing them where they could graze. Then he gathered stones for a fire ring and collected dry wood from the edge of the clearing. The flames caught quickly, pushing back the darkness and bringing welcome warmth. Luis rummaged in his supplies and pulled out a battered coffee pot. "Might help with the evening chill," he offered, holding it up. Miriam hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. The firelight revealed the flush of shame still staining her cheeks, and she seemed about to refuse. But Luis wasn't ready to let the silence stretch any longer. "Saw you in town some weeks back," he said quietly, measuring coffee into the pot. "At the mission house. You were cooking for them orphan children." Surprise flickered across her face. You were there?" Luis nodded, setting the pot in the coals. "Was dropping off some game meat. Watched you manage that whole kitchen like it was nothing. Feeding 20 youngsters with barely any supplies, keeping order without raising your voice once." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Knew right then you could handle more than most men give you credit for." Miriam's hands stilled in her lap. "Is that why?" She paused, then gathered her courage. "Is that why you bid for me today? Because you saw me cook?" "Partly," Luis admitted. "Saw how you worked, how you treated them children, how you didn't waste nothing, but still made sure everyone got enough." He looked up at her directly. "Wasn't pity made me bid today. Wasn't looks neither. Was looking for a partner. Someone who knows what it means to work hard and care for others." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Miriam stared into the flames, something shifting in her expression. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. "I ran my husband's farm," she said, "for 3 years after he took sick, before his family." She swallowed hard. "Before they decided I wasn't fit to stay." Luis kept his movements slow and steady as he pulled 2 tin cups from his pack. "Tell me about it," he said simply. Miriam's fingers traced the edge of her bonnet. "We had dairy cows, chickens, 2 bread ovens that needed firing 3 times a week to keep the family fed, gardens that stretched near half an acre." A hint of pride crept into her voice. "I knew every animal's needs, every crop season. Kept the books in German and English both." "Sounds like a lot of responsibility," Luis commented, pouring the hot coffee. "Yeah, it was, but I loved it." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "The rhythm of the days, the satisfaction of seeing things grow. Even when Thomas was too sick to leave his bed, I made sure the farm prospered. The community." She faltered slightly. "They used to say I had a gift for making things flourish." "Reckon they were right about that," Luis said, holding out a cup of coffee. This time, Miriam took it without hesitation. The steam rose between them as they sat in companionable silence. The fire's warmth seemed to ease something in Miriam's posture, and when she looked at Luis again, the wariness had faded from her eyes. "Your land," she said carefully. "You mentioned a creek and good soil?" Luis nodded, hiding a small smile behind his coffee cup. "Year-round water, even in drought. Bottom fields, deep earth. Good for just about anything that'll grow in these parts. Got some fruit trees started too, though they need proper tending." "And animals? 2 milk cows, handful of chickens, couple of pigs, nothing fancy but enough to build on." He paused, then added, "Could use someone who knows how to make things flourish." Miriam took a slow sip of her coffee, considering. The firelight softened the lines of worry on her face, catching golden glints in her hair where it escaped her bonnet. When she spoke again, her voice held a new note of certainty. "I would like to see this land of yours," she said. "In the morning when there's light." "Our land," Luis corrected gently. If you're willing to make it so. Miriam's hands tightened around her cup, but her voice was steady. Yeah. I think I would like to try. The creek's song filled the night air, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Luis added another log to the fire, watching the sparks spiral up toward the stars. He didn't miss the way Miriam's eyes followed his movements, assessing and practical even in her weariness. Should get some rest, he said, spreading a bedroll near the fire. It's another few hours' ride tomorrow, and the trail doesn't get any smoother. Miriam nodded, finishing her coffee. Thank you, she said softly. For the coffee, and for... She gestured vaguely at the camp, the fire, the night around them. For seeing you, Luis finished quietly. For who you really are. Yeah, she whispered. For that most of all. Luis helped her arrange a comfortable sleeping space on the wagon seat, making sure she had enough blankets against the mountain night's chill. Then he settled on his own bedroll, close enough to the fire to keep it fed through the night. As the flames danced and the creek murmured its endless song, Luis listened to Miriam's breathing grow slow and steady. He thought about the strength hidden beneath her plain exterior, the quiet pride in her voice when she spoke of her farm work. Maybe, he reflected, they both had more to offer than others could see. The night deepened around them, peaceful and full of promise. Tomorrow they would continue their journey, but something had already shifted between them. In the simple sharing of coffee and stories by firelight, they had found the first fragile threads of understanding. Dawn painted the eastern sky in gentle pinks and golds as Luis stirred the campfire's embers back to life. Miriam was already awake, her bonnet neatly tied, smoothing her dark dress with work-worn hands. The morning air held a bite that hinted at the coming autumn. Best get an early start, Luis said, offering her a hand as she climbed down from the wagon seat. Trail gets steeper from here. Miriam nodded, accepting a simple breakfast of dried apple slices and the last of yesterday's cornbread. They ate quickly, both aware of the long journey ahead. Luis noticed how she carefully brushed every crumb into her palm, wasting nothing. Within the hour, they had broken camp. Luis helped Miriam back onto the wagon seat, steadying her with gentle hands. She settled herself with quiet dignity, clutching her small bundle of possessions in her lap. The wagon lurched forward as Luis urged the horses up the winding mountain trail. Tall pines crowded close, their branches casting shifting shadows across the rutted path. The wheels bumped over rocks and roots, making the journey slow and jarring. Sorry for the rough ride, Luis said after a particularly hard jolt nearly unseated them both. Trail ain't seen much traffic lately. I have ridden worse, Miriam replied, her voice steady despite the wagon's constant motion. She paused, then added, In Pennsylvania, spring mud could swallow a wagon whole. Luis glanced at her, catching the ghost of a smile on her face. These small offerings of her past life came rarely, he was learning, like precious coins carefully spent. The sun climbed higher as they wound their way deeper into the mountains. Miriam kept her eyes on the landscape, taking in the stands of aspen, the rocky meadows where wildflowers still bloomed. Once, a deer bounded across their path and Luis heard her soft intake of breath. Near midday, the trail opened onto a wider clearing. Luis drew the horses to a halt. Home, he said simply, gesturing toward the cabin that stood before them. Miriam's eyes widened slightly as she took in the scene. The cabin was rough-hewn, built of sturdy logs but showing clear signs of neglect. The roof sagged slightly on one corner, and weeds had overtaken what might once have been a kitchen garden. A crooked chimney rose from the center, its stones darkened by smoke and weather. Luis jumped down from the wagon, coming around to help Miriam descend. She accepted his assistance with grace, but her attention remained fixed on the cabin and its surroundings. Her gaze swept over the overgrown yard, the empty chicken coop, the half-fallen fence that marked the edge of a small pasture. The creek's just beyond those willows, Luis said, suddenly aware of how primitive it all must look to her. Good water, never runs dry, and the soil's rich in the bottom field, like I mentioned. Miriam nodded, her expression thoughtful. Without a word, she walked to the cabin's door and pushed it open. Luis followed, watching as she surveyed the single room with its dirt floor and sparse furnishings. A rough-built table, 2 mismatched chairs, a narrow bed frame pushed against one wall. There's tools in the lean-to, he offered, and supplies in the wagon need unloading. But Miriam had already spotted something else. She crossed to the corner where a worn broom leaned against the wall, picked it up, and tested its weight in her hands. Then, rolling up her sleeves, she began to sweep. Louise stood for a moment, watching as she attacked the accumulated dirt with steady, practiced strokes. There was something both humble and powerful in the way she set to work without complaint or hesitation. Finally, he turned and went out to begin unloading the wagon. The afternoon passed in steady labor. While Louise carried in supplies and repaired a loose board on the porch, Miriam transformed the cabin's interior. She swept every corner, wiped down the window's grimy pane, and arranged their meager supplies with careful attention to order. When she discovered a dusty Bible on a high shelf, she handled it reverently before placing it in the center of the table. As evening approached, Louise built up the fire in the hearth while Miriam prepared a simple supper from their supplies. The familiar smell of beans and cornbread soon filled the cabin, making it feel more like a home than it had in years. They sat down to eat by lamplight, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log's walls. For a while, there was only the quiet sounds of spoons against tin plates. Then Miriam spoke, her voice soft but clear. "My husband's family," she hesitated, stirring her beans. "They said I was too proud, that I thought too much of my own ways instead of submitting to theirs." She looked up, meeting Louise's eyes across the table. "After Thomas died, they gave me 3 days to leave." Louise set down his spoon, giving her words the weight they deserved. "Must have been hard," he said quietly. "Losing everything at once like that." Miriam's hands twisted in her lap. "I had nowhere to go. The English world." She gestured vaguely at the territory beyond their walls. "It was strange to me. Still is, in many ways. But I could not stay and watch them divide up everything Thomas and I had built together." Louise nodded slowly. "Know something about starting over," he said. "Spent 15 years in the mountains, trapping and trading. Living alone got easier after a while. Maybe too easy." He stared into the firelight, remembering. Sometimes weeks would go by without seeing another soul. Started to forget what it was like, having folks around. "But you came back," Miriam observed. "Figured it was time," Louise admitted. "Bought this place 3 years ago. Meant to fix it up proper, but..." He shrugged, looking around at the bare walls, the patched roof. "Guess I lost the knack of making a real home." Miriam followed his gaze, taking in the cabin's rough comfort. "A home needs time," she said carefully. "And patient hands." "Reckon you're right about that," Louise agreed. They finished their meal in companionable silence. While Louise cleaned the plates, Miriam tidied away the remaining food and swept the hearth one final time. Then, as the last light faded outside their windows, she knelt beside the table. Folding her hands, Miriam began to pray aloud in German, her voice carrying the familiar cadence of long practice. Though Louise couldn't understand the words, their quiet reverence filled the cabin. He bowed his head, listening to the rise and fall of her voice, remembering prayers from his own childhood, long forgotten, but not entirely lost. The night wind whistled through the pine trees outside, carrying the wild scent of sage and coming snow. But inside the cabin, the lamplight glowed warm and steady. Louise watched as Miriam rose from her prayers, her face peaceful despite the day's labors. "Sleep well," he said, moving toward his bedroll near the hearth. "Tomorrow we can see about fixing that roof." Miriam nodded, settling onto the bed he had insisted she take. "Yeah, there is much work to be done," she agreed. But there was no complaint in her voice, only quiet determination. As the lamp burned low and the fire settled into coals, Louise listened to the familiar sounds of the mountain night. But now there was something new. The soft sound of Miriam's breathing, the rustle of her movement as she settled into sleep. The cabin felt different, as if her presence had already begun to change it from a mere shelter into something more. The last thing Louise saw before closing his eyes was the Bible on the table, its worn cover catching the dying firelight. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more careful steps toward understanding. But for now, in this moment, the lonely cabin had become a beginning. The mountain mornings brought crisp air and birdsong through the cabin's single window. Each dawn, Miriam rose early to kindle the hearth fire, her quiet movements familiar now in the dim light. Luis would often wake to find her already at work, her capable hands busy with some new task to bring order to their shared space. On the third morning, Miriam discovered a cache of preserved vegetables in the root cellar, dusty jars that Luis had traded for and then forgotten. She spent hours washing them clean, arranging them on newly scrubbed shelves according to type and age. When Luis returned from mending fences that afternoon, the cellar had transformed from a dark hole into an organized storehouse. "Much obliged," he said, studying the neat rows. "Reckon I'd forgotten half of what was down here." Miriam nodded, satisfaction evident in her face despite her modest demeanor. "The Lord provides," she said simply. "We must be good stewards of His gifts." The next day she turned her attention to the cabin's interior. Using spare cotton cloth she'd brought in her meager belongings, Miriam fashioned simple curtains for the window. Her stitches were small and even, each one placed with careful precision. The fabric was plain, but when she hung the curtains, the harsh sunlight softened into a gentler glow. Luis watched from the doorway as she stepped back to survey her work. "Makes quite a difference," he offered. "Yeah," Miriam agreed. "A home needs softness as well as strength." She smoothed the fabric with work-roughened hands, then turned to the next task waiting. Outside, the spring air carried hints of warming soil. Miriam spent hours clearing a patch of earth near the cabin, pulling weeds and turning the rich dirt. Luis brought her tools from the lean-to, a rusty hoe, a dented watering can, stakes for marking rows. She accepted each one with quiet thanks, already planning where each vegetable would grow best. "The soil here is good," she said, crumbling dark earth between her fingers. "With God's blessing, we will have fresh vegetables before summer's end." Luis nodded, remembering his mother's garden from long ago. "Used to help my mama plant corn and beans," he said. She knew just when to put each seed in the ground. Miriam looked up at him, interest warming her plain features. "Your mother was a gardener?" "Yeah," Luis said softly. "Had the greenest thumb in the valley, folks used to say. Could make anything grow." He paused, surprised by the sudden ache of memory. "Been a long time since I thought about her garden." Miriam was quiet for a moment, her hands still in the soil. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "you would help me plant the corn when the time comes? I would value your memory of how it was done." Luis felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of old grief he hadn't known he still carried. "Reckon I could do that," he said. As the days passed, the cabin and its surroundings began to change. Miriam's bread, baked in the stone hearth, filled their home with warmth and welcome scents. She had brought her own sourdough starter, carefully preserved through her journey, and now the tang of fresh-baked loaves drew notice from passing neighbors. The Wilsons rode by one afternoon, ostensibly to check property boundaries but clearly curious about Luis's new bride. Sarah Wilson's eyes widened at the sight of Miriam's sturdy frame in its plain dress, and she whispered something to her husband that made him snicker. But when Miriam offered them fresh bread and herb tea, the laughter faded into surprised appreciation. "This is mighty fine bread, Mrs. Cade," Sarah admitted, using the name that still felt strange to both Luis and Miriam. "Danke," Miriam replied simply. "God gives us grain and strength to bake it." After the Wilsons left, Luis found Miriam in the garden, methodically weeding between rows of tiny sprouts. "Don't let their talk trouble you," he said, remembering Sarah's earlier whispers. Miriam sat back on her heels, wiping soil from her hands. "Their words cannot harm me," she said. "I know my worth lies not in their judgment, but in God's sight." She turned her attention back to the tender plants. "And these little ones care nothing for how I look, only that I tend them well." The next visitors were the Hendersons from the valley below. They brought a welcoming gift of chicken feed and wire, having heard that Luis had taken a wife. Old Joe Henderson's eyes narrowed at sight of Miriam's plain dress and prayer covering. But when she showed him her neat rows of emerging vegetables, he nodded with grudging respect. "Takes a skilled hand to get things growing this high up," he allowed. "Most folks can't manage it." "The Lord guides my hands," Miriam responded. "I only follow his leading." That evening, after their visitors had gone, Luis and Miriam sat in comfortable silence by the fire. The day's work was done. Roof patches secured against spring rains, garden tended, bread cooling on the shelf. Through the curtained window, the last sunlight painted the mountains gold. Miriam's rocking chair, rescued from the cabin's loft and carefully mended, creaked a gentle rhythm. Then, soft as an evening breeze, she began to sing. The words were German, unfamiliar to Luis's ears, but the melody carried clear and true. It was a hymn, he realized, the kind his mother used to sing while working in her garden or cooking at the stove. Luis closed his eyes, letting the simple tune wash over him. Without conscious thought, he found himself humming along, remembering bits and pieces of the old songs. When he opened his eyes, he found Miriam watching him, a quiet smile touching her face. "You know the music?" she asked. "My mama." Luis cleared his throat. "She used to sing something like it. Been so long I'd almost forgotten." Miriam nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Music stays in the heart," she said, "even when we think it's lost." She began another verse, her voice carrying the ancient words with practiced ease. As the fire settled into coals and darkness gathered outside their walls, Luis felt something shift and settle in his spirit. The cabin had changed in these past days, not just in its appearance, but in its very nature. What had been merely shelter was becoming something more. Miriam's presence filled the spaces that had been empty for so long. Her quiet faith, expressed in labor and song, had begun to warm not just the cabin's walls, but also the cold places in Luis's heart. He found himself watching her as she worked, marveling at how her steady hands brought order from chaos, beauty from plainness. The neighbors still came by, some to mock, others to judge, but increasingly, they fell silent when they saw the changes taking place. The sagging roof was straight now, the garden flourishing, the windows bright with curtains and lamplight, and at the center of it all was Miriam, moving through her days with quiet purpose, transforming their rough home with patient faith and willing hands. That night, as Miriam's hymn faded into the mountain darkness, Luis realized he was humming along without thought or effort. The melody felt both strange and familiar, like coming home to a place he'd forgotten he knew. He caught Miriam's eye across the firelight, and for a moment they shared something deeper than words, an understanding that this cabin, this partnership, was becoming more than either of them had dared to hope. The evening settled around them, peaceful and warm. Outside, the wind whispered through pine needles, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. But inside their cabin, Miriam's song and Luis's gentle harmony filled the air with something that felt very much like hope. The morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight spilling over the mountain peaks. Miriam was already at work in her garden, her plain dress dusted with soil as she tended the young plants. Luis had just finished mending a broken fence post when the sound of hoofbeats echoed up the trail. Deputy Carl Mercer appeared around the bend, his badge gleaming in the morning light. His mount, a sleek bay gelding, kicked up dust as it picked its way along the rough path. Luis straightened slowly, noting the official-looking envelope in the deputy's hand and the smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man and his Amish cook," Mercer called out, reining his horse to a stop. His eyes flickered to Miriam, who had risen from her garden work but kept her distance, hands folded at her waist. Luis wiped his palms on his trousers, saying nothing. The deputy's presence never meant good news, and something in the young man's satisfied expression made his stomach tighten. "Got some important business here," Mercer announced, drawing himself up importantly. He extended the envelope. "Official notice from the territorial office. Railroads got plans for this valley." Luis took the envelope with careful hands. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used for government business. He broke the seal slowly, aware of Mercer's eager eyes watching his every move. The letter inside was written in flowing script, all formal language and official stamps. As he read, the morning's warmth seemed to fade. The railroad had mapped their route west, and their valley lay directly in its path. The letter spoke of progress, of civilization's inevitable march, of fair compensation for those who cooperated. Between the elegant phrases lay a harder truth: resist, and the land would be seized anyway. Quite an opportunity, Mercer said, clearly enjoying himself. Though I reckon you've already proved yourself none too clever when it comes to property decisions. His gaze slid meaningfully toward Miriam, who stood silent near her garden, her face composed but her hands clasped tightly together. That all you came to say? Luis asked quietly. His voice was level, but there was an edge to it that made the deputy's horse shift nervously. Mercer's smile thinned. Just doing my duty, delivering official papers. Though I will say, if I was fool enough to tie myself to an Amish cook, I'd take whatever offer came my way and count myself lucky. Luis took a step forward. The deputy's hand twitched toward his gun, but Luis merely folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Much obliged for the delivery, he said flatly. You can ride on now. Color rose in Mercer's face at the dismissal. He opened his mouth as if to say more, then thought better of it. With a sharp jerk on his reins, he turned his horse around. Railroad men will be coming through soon enough, he called over his shoulder. Best think careful about your answer. They watched until the deputy disappeared down the trail. Only then did Luis turn to Miriam, who had not moved from her spot by the garden. Her face was tight, but her voice was steady when she spoke. The Lord gives and takes away, she said softly. Blessed be his name. Luis pulled out the letter again, studying the official seals. They're offering money, he said. Not much, but enough to start somewhere else. Miriam walked over to him, her steps measured and calm. She looked at the paper in his hands, then up at the cabin they had worked so hard to make into a home. The morning sun caught the new curtains she had sewn, made the fresh painted window frames gleam. God will make a way, she said with quiet certainty. He did not bring us here to abandon us now. Luis wished he could share her faith. He had seen too many small holders pushed out, too many promises broken. The railroad companies had money, lawyers, and the government's ear. What did they have? A patch of rocky soil, a half-rebuilt cabin and each other. The day passed in a haze of worried thoughts. Luis went through his usual tasks mechanically, checking trap lines, hauling water, splitting wood. Every now and then he would pause, looking down the valley where someday iron rails might slice through their land. Miriam kept to her own rhythm as steady as always. She weeded the garden, fed the chickens, and gathered eggs. When evening approached, she began preparing supper as if it were any other day. The familiar sounds of her work filled the cabin. The scrape of the flour bin, the thump of dough being turned onto the table, the quiet humming of hymns as she kneaded. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, their wild voices echoing off the valley walls. Luis stood in the doorway, watching darkness gather over the land he had come to love. The weight of choice pressed heavy on his shoulders. Should they run while they could, find some more remote valley where progress might not follow? Should they take the railroad's money and try to build again elsewhere? Or should they stand their ground, knowing it might cost them everything? The bread will be ready soon, Miriam said behind him. He turned to find her working the dough with strong, sure movements. A light sheen of flour dusted her arms, and her face was peaceful in the lamplight. How can you be so calm, he asked. Everything we've built here is in God's hands, she finished, just as it has always been. She shaped the dough into a loaf with practiced motions. The rail barons think themselves mighty, but the Lord is stronger. He sees the sparrow fall, and he sees us. Luis moved closer, watching her work. There was something hypnotic about the steady rhythm of her hands, something soothing in her unwavering faith. And if they force us out, then we will go where he leads. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and direct. But first we must be still and listen for his guidance. Fear is a poor counselor. The coyote's song rose and fell outside their walls as Luis considered her words. He had spent so many years alone, trusting only himself, carrying the weight of every decision on his own shoulders. Now, watching Miriam's calm strength as she shaped order from chaos, beauty from simple ingredients, he felt something shift inside him. She was right. Fear clouded judgment and haste led to poor choices. Whatever they decided, it would be better chosen from strength than panic. He found himself breathing easier, steadied by her certainty, even if he couldn't fully share it. Miriam slid the finished loaf into the oven and straightened, dusting flour from her apron. "Come," she said. "Help me shell these peas while we wait for the bread. There is time enough to think on tomorrow when tomorrow comes." Louise pulled up a chair beside her. Together they worked in comfortable silence as evening deepened around their cabin. The bread's rich aroma filled the air, mingling with the sharp mountain winds that swept down from the peaks. Whatever challenges lay ahead this moment, their hands moving in shared purpose, the warmth of their home holding back the darkness, felt solid and real. The railroad's threat still loomed, but it no longer seemed to fill the whole horizon. Louise watched Miriam's capable hands moving among the pea pods and remembered how she had transformed their cabin from a mere shelter into a true home. Perhaps her faith wasn't as foreign to him as he'd once thought. There was strength in it, not blind optimism, but a deep-rooted certainty that went beyond mere circumstances. As night settled fully over the valley, the coyotes' chorus faded into scattered yips and then silence. The bread came out of the oven, golden brown and fragrant. Louise watched Miriam set it to cool, her movements as measured and peaceful as ever. Whatever choice lay before them, he realized, they would face it together, and somehow that made the weight of it easier to bear. Spring crept into the valley like a shy child, touching the world with tentative fingers of warmth. The snow retreated first from the lower slopes, then gradually up the mountainsides, leaving behind muddy earth that steamed in the strengthening sun. Miriam watched the changing season from her garden, where tiny green shoots pushed through the dark soil with determined persistence. She had expanded the garden over the winter months, working whenever the weather allowed. Now neat rows stretched in tidy lines, herbs for healing, vegetables for sustenance, and flowers for beauty's sake. Louise had helped her build raised beds bordered with river stones, their shapes as varied as the mountains themselves. One crisp morning, as dawn painted the sky in delicate pinks and golds, Miriam knelt in the damp earth, carefully tending to her herb garden. The mint was spreading enthusiastically, its fresh scent rising with every touch. Beside it, chamomile sprouted in delicate clusters, while sage and yarrow showed their first tender leaves. She handled each plant with reverence, murmuring old German prayers of thanksgiving. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. A woman from down in the valley, Sarah Jenkins, rode up leading a second horse with two small children clinging to its back. Even from a distance, Miriam could see the worry etched on Sarah's face. "Mrs. Cade," Sarah called out, her voice tight with concern. "My youngest, she's burning up something fierce. Nothing I try seems to help." Miriam rose, brushing earth from her apron. "Bring her inside," she said, already moving toward the cabin. She had been expecting this visit since hearing about fever spreading through the valley settlement. The sick child, no more than 4 years old, lay listless in her mother's arms as Sarah carried her into the cabin. Miriam directed them to the rocking chair by the hearth, then gathered her supplies, dried herbs, clean cloths, and a kettle of fresh water. "How long has the fever lasted?" she asked, laying a gentle hand on the child's forehead. 3 days now," Sarah replied, watching anxiously as Miriam worked. "Started with a cough, then the heat came. Doctor's 2 days ride away, and—" She hesitated, twisting her hands. "Well, truth is, we couldn't afford him anyway." Miriam nodded, understanding both what was said and what wasn't. She measured herbs into a cup: chamomile for fever, elderberry to fight sickness, honey to soothe. While the tea steeped, she soaked cloths in cool water and laid them on the child's forehead and wrists. "Keep these fresh," she instructed Sarah, "and make sure she drinks whenever she wakes." She demonstrated how to check the temperature of the tea, how to support the little one's head while drinking. Sarah clutched the bundle of herbs Miriam pressed into her hands. "I can't pay you," she began, but Miriam shook her head. "God's gifts are free," she said simply. "Just bring me eggs when your hens are laying well again." As spring advanced, more people found their way to Miriam's door. A mother with a colicky baby, an old man with joint pain, children with various scrapes and ailments. She treated them all with the same gentle attention, dispensing herbs and wisdom in equal measure. Luis watched this transformation with quiet pride. He had known somehow that Miriam would make more of their home than just a place to weather the seasons. Now he saw how her presence rippled outward, touching lives beyond their cabin walls. He found his own way to help, too. When he heard about Widow Thompson struggling to keep her home warm, he began leaving split firewood by her door. When young Tom Baker broke his leg, Luis helped repair his family's roof before the spring rains. Small acts done without fanfare or expectation of thanks. One sunny Sunday morning, they hitched up the wagon for the long ride to church. The little valley church wasn't much, just rough-hewn logs and simple benches, but Miriam insisted on attending whenever weather permitted. Luis went with her, more for her company than from any deep faith of his own. The congregation had grown as winter eased into spring. Families who had once kept their distance now nodded in greeting. Children who had whispered and pointed now ran to Miriam with flowers or interesting stones they had found. Preacher Whitfield stood at the door after service, shaking hands and offering blessings. When Miriam approached, he reached for both her hands. "Sister Cade," he said warmly, "I must thank you properly. Little Mary Chen would not be with us today if not for your knowledge and care." Miriam ducked her head, uncomfortable with praise. "The Lord does the healing," she murmured. "I only tend the herbs he provides." "Nevertheless," the preacher insisted, "you were his instrument in this case. We are blessed to have you among us." Luis, standing quietly beside his wife, noticed several townspeople listening. Some of the very ones who had laughed loudest at the auction now couldn't meet his eyes. Shame colored their faces as they recalled their cruel jests about his big wife and foolish choice. On the wagon ride home, Luis reached over and covered Miriam's hand with his own. The spring sunshine played across the greening valley, and birds called from budding branches overhead. "You've changed things," he said softly. "Changed how they see us." Miriam's free hand absently touched the prayer bonnet she still wore proudly. "This too is God's work," she whispered. "He uses our trials to open hearts, theirs and ours." She squeezed his hand gently. "Even mockery can become mercy in His time." Luis nodded, understanding more than he could express. The valley spread before them, dotted with new leaves and fresh beginnings. Their cabin waited ahead, no longer a lonely outpost, but a beacon of hope for their neighbors. Spring had indeed brought new life to more than just the land. The wagon wheels creaked steadily as they made their way home, where Miriam's gardens flourished under her careful tending. Like those growing plants, something else was taking root in the valley. Something built of small kindnesses, patient care, and steady faith. The seeds of community, Luis realized, grew just as surely as Miriam's herbs, needing only time and tender attention to flourish. The July sun beat down mercilessly on the valley, turning the grass golden and the creek sluggish. Evening brought little relief as heat lingered in the earth, making sleep restless and work harder. Miriam wiped sweat from her brow as she gathered the last herbs before sunset, her basket heavy with yarrow and willow bark. Luis stood at the fence line, repairing posts that had worked loose in the dry soil. He paused, straightening his aching back, and noticed the dark clouds building over the western peaks. The thunderheads rolled and boiled against the darkening sky, promising either blessing or destruction, sometimes both in these mountain summers. "Storm's coming," he called to Miriam, who nodded without looking up from her work. She could feel it too. The electric tension in the air, the way the birds had gone quiet, the restless wind that carried the scent of rain. They had just finished bringing in the laundry when they heard hoofbeats approaching at a gallop. Through the gathering gloom, they saw young Tom Baker riding hard, his horse lathered despite the late hour. Luis stepped out onto the porch, hand instinctively going to his belt, but Tom's face spoke of urgency rather than danger. "Mr. Cade, Mrs. Cade." Tom reined his horse to a sliding stop, dust billowing around its hooves. "Cholera's broke out in the mining camps. It's spreading fast. 3 dead already in Copper Creek, and more sick in Silver Glen." Miriam appeared beside Luis, her face grave. "How many children?" she asked quietly. "At least 6 down with it, ma'am. Dr. Reynolds is stuck 2 valleys over with a broken leg. Folks are scared to go near the sick ones." Before Luis could speak, Miriam turned and went back into the cabin. He heard her moving purposefully, gathering supplies. When she emerged, she carried her medicine bag and a stack of clean linens. "We must open our home to them," she said, her voice firm. "The sick need clean water and proper care." She looked at Luis. and he saw in her eyes the same determination that had first caught his attention at the auction square. "It's dangerous," he said softly. "Cholera takes strong men in hours." "God did not give us this home to hide in while children die," she replied, already loading supplies into their wagon. "Thomas, ride back and tell them we're coming. Tell them to bring the sickest children here first." Luis knew better than to argue. Instead, he began gathering wood. They would need plenty for boiling water and keeping warm despite the coming storm. As Tom rode off, the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the valley. Through the night, they worked steadily. Luis dug proper latrines well away from the water source, while Miriam transformed their cabin into a sick room. She pushed their bed against one wall and laid out pallets on the floor, each with clean blankets and a basin nearby. The first families arrived as lightning split the sky. Parents carried limp children, their small faces gray with sickness. Miriam directed them with calm efficiency, showing them where to lay their precious burdens. Her voice remained steady as she instructed helpers how to boil water, prepare willow bark tea, and mix rehydrating solutions of water, salt, and sugar. Luis kept the fires burning despite the rain, chopping wood until his arms trembled with exhaustion. Every time he entered the cabin with fresh water or wood, he saw Miriam moving from patient to patient, her face lined with concentration as she checked temperatures, administered medicines, and whispered prayers in German. The storm raged through the night, but a worse storm raged inside the cabin. Children cried weakly, parents wept, and the awful sounds of sickness filled the air. Miriam worked tirelessly, showing parents how to clean and care for their little ones. She taught them to watch for signs of improvement or worsening, how to coax small sips of liquid into reluctant mouths. Dawn brought more families seeking help. Luis expanded the latrine trenches and built rough shelters for those who couldn't fit in the cabin. The air grew thick with wood smoke and the sharp scent of herbs as Miriam steeped endless batches of medicinal tea. Days blurred together. Luis lost count of the wood he chopped, the water he carried, the graves he helped dig for those they couldn't save. Each loss hit Miriam hard, though she allowed herself only brief moments of grief before turning to the next patient who needed her. One night, after helping a mother clean her feverish child, Luis found Miriam kneeling beside a small pallet where 6-year-old Sarah Chen lay fighting for her life. Her eyes were closed, her lips moving in silent prayer as she held the girl's tiny hand. The lamplight caught the tears on her cheeks, but her other hand never stopped bathing the child's forehead with cool water. Luis watched his wife, marveling at her strength. She had been working for days with little rest, yet her touch remained gentle, her voice soothing as she hummed hymns to comfort the sick and frightened children. He saw in her face the same look she wore when tending her garden, patient, focused, nurturing life with unwavering dedication. Weeks passed. Gradually, fewer new cases appeared. More children began to show signs of recovery, weak smiles, requests for food, color returning to pale faces. Miriam taught recovering patients' mothers how to make nourishing broths and healing teas, passing on knowledge that might save lives in the future. The cabin had become more than a sick room. It was a place of learning, of community coming together in crisis. Women who had once whispered about the strange Amish widow now listened intently to her instructions. Men who had laughed at Luis's choice of bride now respectfully asked his advice about sanitation and water safety. Finally, one quiet evening, the last fever broke. Little Sarah Chen, who had hovered between life and death for so long, opened her eyes and asked for water. Her mother burst into tears of joy, and the news spread quickly through the makeshift camp that had grown around the cabin. Luis stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. The cabin bore the marks of its transformation, scorched spots on the floor from spilled medicines, herbs hanging everywhere to dry, makeshift pallets still scattered about. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of wood smoke, bitter herbs, and sickness, but underneath it all was the unmistakable fragrance of life preserved. Miriam sat in her rocking chair, finally allowing exhaustion to show on her face. Her prayer bonnet was slightly askew, her apron stained with medicines, but her eyes were bright with thankfulness as she watched mothers gathering their recovering children. "You've done God's work here," Luis said quietly, moving to stand beside her chair. She reached up and took his hand, her grip strong despite her weariness. "We did," she corrected gently. I couldn't have helped anyone without you keeping the fires burning, the water flowing, the walls standing strong. Looking down at their clasped hands, Luis realized something had shifted during these weeks of crisis. The partnership that had begun as a practical arrangement at an auction square had deepened into something more profound. Together, they had created not just a home but a haven, not just a marriage, but a mission. The last of the recovering families left the next day, taking with them medicines, instructions, and a new respect for the strange couple on the mountain. The cabin seemed eerily quiet after so many weeks of constant activity. As Miriam began the task of cleaning and restoring order, she paused now and then to touch the walls, the furniture, the objects that had witnessed so much suffering and survival. Luis watched her from the doorway, struck by how right she looked there. This strong, compassionate woman who had transformed his solitary existence into something rich with purpose. She had brought life to more than just his cabin. She had brought hope to an entire community. Outside, the summer sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors as vivid as Miriam's garden flowers. The air was sweet with the scent of rain-washed earth and blooming herbs. From somewhere in the valley came the sound of children's laughter, precious sounds that might have been silenced forever without Miriam's skilled hands and faithful heart. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the summer sun already warming the mountain air. Luis helped Miriam into their freshly cleaned wagon, noting how she had taken extra care with her appearance today. Her black dress was newly pressed, her prayer bonnet pristine, and she'd even added a small bunch of wildflowers to the basket of food she carried. The drive to town was quiet, both of them lost in thought. The wheels creaked over familiar ruts in the dirt road as they passed homesteads where, just days ago, children had lain desperately ill. Now, smoke rose cheerfully from chimneys and healthy youngsters waved as they passed. When they reached the white-painted church, the square was already filled with wagons and horses. Luis helped Miriam down, conscious of the many eyes watching them. Some gazes still held traces of judgment or mockery, but others showed something new: respect. Inside, the wooden pews were nearly full. The familiar scents of pine soap, starched collars, and summer sweat filled the air. Luis and Miriam found seats near the back, as was their custom. She smoothed her skirts and folded her hands in her lap, eyes forward, ignoring the whispers that followed their entrance. Reverend Matthew stood to begin the service, his voice carrying clearly through the sunlit church. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "we gather today with special cause for thanksgiving. The Lord has seen fit to spare many of our children from the deadly cholera that swept through our valley." A murmur of agreement rippled through the congregation. Parents held their children closer, remembering how close they had come to losing them. "But the Lord works through human hands," the Reverend continued, "and today I wish to recognize those who served as his instruments of healing." He gestured toward the back pew. Miriam Cade opened her home, and her heart to the sick and suffering. Day and night she worked tirelessly to save our little ones. Miriam's cheeks flushed pink, but she kept her eyes lowered modestly. Luis felt pride swelling in his chest. "Would anyone like to speak?" the Reverend asked. For a moment, the church was silent. Then Sarah Chen's mother stood, her daughter healthy and bright-eyed beside her. "My Sarah would not be here today if not for Miriam's care," she said, her voice trembling. "When everyone else feared to touch the sick, she took us in. She taught me how to nurse my child back to health, sharing wisdom I'll never forget." Another woman rose, clutching a small boy's hand. "My Tommy, too," she added. "Miriam showed me how to make the healing teas, how to bring down his fever. She never once complained, though she worked until she could barely stand." More parents stood, one after another, sharing stories of Miriam's dedication and skill. Luis watched his wife's face as she received their gratitude with quiet dignity. Tears glimmered in her eyes, but she remained composed, occasionally nodding in acknowledgement. Then Thomas Miller, one of the men who had laughed loudest at their wedding, slowly got to his feet. "I reckon I owe an apology," he said gruffly. "I judged wrong, and I'm man enough to admit it. Miriam Cade's worth more to this community than a dozen fine ladies from back east." The admission sparked a fresh wave of murmurs. Luis felt something shift in the atmosphere of the church, like ice breaking up in spring. Without thinking, He reached over and took Miriam's hand in his, holding it firmly where everyone could see. She started slightly at the public display but didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers tightened around his, warm and strong. More whispers rustled through the pews, but now he caught words like sweet and proper couple. Among them. The service continued with hymns and prayers, but the mood had changed. When they filed out into the sunshine afterward, people didn't hurry away as usual. They lingered, forming small groups that talked and laughed together. Miriam set up her cooking pot over a small fire, the rich smell of her rabbit stew drawing children like honey draws bees. Luis noticed she had made extra, knowing there would be hungry little ones about. He watched her ladle generous portions into tin cups, making sure each child had enough. Seeing an opportunity to contribute, Luis pulled out his pocket knife and some scraps of wood he had brought along. Soon, he had a small audience of his own as he began carving simple toys, horses, dogs, little wagons with turning wheels. "Make mine a bear," called Tommy Miller, his eyes bright with excitement. "Nah, do a mountain lion," another boy shouted. Luis smiled, letting their enthusiasm wash over him as his knife shaped the wood. He remembered his own father making such toys for him, long ago in Texas. The skills came back naturally, the quick cuts to rough out a shape, the careful details that brought it to life. The afternoon stretched on pleasantly. Women shared recipes with Miriam, asking about her herbs and medicines. Men discussed the weather and crops with Luis, treating him with new respect. Even those who still held themselves apart seemed less hostile, more thoughtful. As the sun began to sink, parents gathered their children, who clutched new wooden toys and begged for one last spoonful of stew. Miriam packed up her cooking pot while Luis loaded the wagon. The Reverend Matthews came to shake their hands, thanking them again for their service to the community. The drive home was different from the morning journey. Miriam hummed softly, her face peaceful in the golden evening light. Luis felt content in a way he hadn't known was possible, as if some tight band around his heart had finally loosened. When they reached their cabin, Luis helped Miriam down from the wagon, but he didn't release her hand immediately. "You've done more than just heal the sick," he said quietly. "You've helped heal this whole community." She smiled up at him, her face glowing with joy and something deeper, the satisfaction of living out God's purpose. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she replied. "Sometimes it takes illness to bring health, and sometimes it takes being an outsider to bring people together." Luis nodded, understanding what she meant. They had both been outsiders, the scarred mountain man and the cast-off Amish widow. Yet somehow, their unlikely union had become a source of strength and healing for others. Later that evening, after Miriam had gone to bed, Luis sat at the rough-hewn table and unfolded the telegram that had arrived earlier that week. The paper was thin, but the words carried heavy weight. "Railroad surveyors arriving next month. Stop. Prepare for preliminary assessment. Stop. Compensation to be discussed. Stop." He studied the message for a long moment, then carefully folded it away again. The happiness in Miriam's eyes today had been too precious to spoil with such news. Tomorrow would be soon enough to face this new challenge. For now, he wanted to hold on to the memory of this day, the respect in people's voices, the children's laughter, and most of all, the feeling of Miriam's hand in his, strong and sure before all the world. The cabin was quiet except for the soft sounds of Miriam's breathing from behind the curtain that divided their sleeping space. Outside, crickets chirped in the summer darkness, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine through the open window. Luis sat for a while longer, watching the moonlight pattern the floor through the curtains Miriam had made, thinking about how much had changed since that day in the auction square. The telegram weighed on his mind, but he pushed the worry aside for now. They had faced mockery, illness, and hardship together. Whatever came next, they would face that too, with the same strength and faith that had brought them this far. The July sun beat down mercilessly as Luis watched strange men in dusty suits pace across his land. They carried brass instruments on tripods, measuring and sighting along invisible lines. Their boots crushed the edge of Miriam's herb garden without a second glance. Luis stood on his porch, one hand resting on the weathered post. The strangers had been at it since dawn, driving wooden stakes into the earth with painted red flags that fluttered like wounds against the grass. His jaw tightened as they drew closer to the cabin. Finally, he stepped down into the yard. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he called out, keeping his voice steady. "Might want to be careful where you're putting those stakes. This here's private property." The men paused their work. The leader, a thin fellow with a waxed mustache, pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Mr. Cade, I presume?" He didn't wait for confirmation. "We are authorized surveyors for the Denver and Rio Grande Railway Company. According to these government maps, this valley's been designated for the new rail line." "That may be what your papers say," Luis replied carefully. "But I've got papers of my own. This land's deeded to me fair and square." The men exchanged amused glances. The leader's laugh was sharp as a crow's call. "Perhaps you don't understand progress, Mr. Cade. This railway's coming through whether you like it or not. The government's granted us right-of-way. Your quaint little homestead won't stop the march of civilization." His eyes flicked dismissively toward the cabin where Miriam stood in the doorway, her plain dress and prayer bonnet marking her as different. The other men snickered. Luis's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he kept them there. "I understand plenty," he said quietly, "including that you're trespassing. I'm asking you politely to leave." "Or what?" One of the younger surveyors called out. "You and your Amish woman gonna pray us away?" More laughter. The leader rolled his maps with deliberate slowness. "We'll be back, Mr. Cade, with proper authority. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." They gathered their equipment and moved down the valley, leaving their stakes like thorns in Luis's flesh. That evening, Miriam laid out a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and fresh vegetables from her garden. Luis sat heavily at the table, his appetite gone. The setting sun painted the cabin walls gold, but he couldn't appreciate its beauty. "The Lord will show us the way," Miriam said softly, watching his face. "We must have faith." Luis's fist came down on the table, making the tin plates rattle. "Faith won't stop them from taking everything we've built." He immediately regretted his outburst when he saw her flinch. "I'm sorry, Miriam, but you didn't see how they looked at us, like we're nothing but dirt to be cleared away." She reached across the table and covered his clenched fist with her hand. "Then we must show them we're more than that. Violence will only prove them right about us." Luis wanted to believe her, but something dark churned in his gut. He'd seen that look in men's eyes before, during the war. The look that said they'd already decided you weren't human enough to matter. For 3 days, they tried to carry on normally. Miriam tended her gardens and mixed her medicines. Luis repaired fences and chopped wood. But the stakes with their red flags seemed to multiply overnight, and strange men kept riding past, watching. On the 4th day, Luis woke to the smell of smoke. He burst out of the cabin into early morning darkness. Orange flames lit the sky where their barn stood. Dark figures moved against the fire, spreading it deliberately. Others were trampling through Miriam's gardens, destroying months of careful tending. "No!" Luis shouted, running toward them. A warning shot cracked past his head. "Take the hint, Cade," a voice called from the shadows. "Next one won't miss." Miriam appeared beside him, gasping at the destruction. She started toward her precious herb garden, but thick smoke rolled across the yard. She doubled over, coughing, her breath coming in desperate wheezes. Luis grabbed her arm. "Inside. Now." They stumbled back toward the cabin as more shots split the night. Behind them, cruel laughter mixed with the crackle of flames. He got Miriam to their bed, but her coughing wouldn't stop. Each breath seemed to tear at her chest. Her face had gone gray, and her lips were taking on a bluish tinge that turned Luis's blood to ice. "Hold on," he pleaded, wrapping her in blankets. "Just hold on." He ran to fetch water, hearing hoofbeats fade into the distance as the raiders departed. Dawn broke red through the smoke. Luis sat beside Miriam's bed, watching her struggle for air. Her normally sturdy frame seemed suddenly fragile. The smoke had aggravated her chest weakness, the one she usually hid so well behind her strength. A pounding at the door made him jump. He opened it to find Sarah Chen's mother, her face pinched with worry. "We saw the smoke," she said. "Is Miriam—" She broke off at the sound of harsh coughing from inside. Word spread quickly. Throughout the morning, neighbors arrived to help put out the smoldering barn and salvage what they could of the gardens. But Luis heard their whispers. Poor woman won't last long with lungs like that. Always was too heavy to be healthy. Shame about the garden, but maybe it's for the best, can't fight progress. Even those who had praised them in church now shook their heads and muttered about knowing your place. Luis wanted to rage at their fickleness, but Miriam needed him more. Her fever rose as the day wore on. The local doctor came and went, leaving bitter medicine but little hope. Smoke inhalation's bad enough for healthy folks, he said. For someone of her constitution. He didn't finish the thought. Night fell again. Luis sat in the darkness by Miriam's bed, listening to her labored breathing. The woman who had brought life and warmth to his lonely existence now fought for every breath. His strong, gentle wife, who had faced mockery with dignity and hatred with forgiveness, lay pale and still except for her desperate gasping. Something broke inside him. Luis fell to his knees beside the bed, clasping Miriam's hot hand between his own. "Please," he whispered hoarsely. "Please, God." The words felt strange in his mouth after so many years. "Don't take her from me. I know I turned my back on you. I know I lost my way after the war. But Miriam never did. She's kept faith through everything." Tears he hadn't shed in years burned his eyes. "She sees you in every sunrise, every plant that grows, every person who needs help. She taught me to see you again too. Please, please don't let it end like this." His voice broke. "I'll do anything, fight the railway company, walk away from the land, whatever you want. Just don't take her. She's all the good I have in this world." Through the window came the distant howl of coyotes. The cabin that had become a home under Miriam's care now felt cold and empty despite her presence. Luis bowed his head over their clasped hands and did something he hadn't done since he was a boy. He prayed through the night, watching, waiting, and begging for mercy. The fever held her in its grip until false dawn, when the sky began to lighten behind the mountains. Luis had not moved from his vigil. His knees ached and his back was stiff, but he kept praying, reciting half-remembered verses Miriam had taught him, making promises to a God he wasn't sure still listened. The nights blurred together in a haze of worry and exhaustion. Luis kept vigil by Miriam's bedside, replacing cool cloths on her forehead as fever burned through her sturdy frame. Each rattling breath seemed to tear at her chest, and her usual rosy complexion had faded to an ashen gray. "Just a little water," he would murmur, lifting her head gently to help her sip from a tin cup. Sometimes she was lucid enough to swallow. Other times, the liquid just trickled down her chin while she tossed in delirium. The doctor came twice more, bringing stronger medicines, but his grim expression said more than his words. "Keep her comfortable," was all he offered before riding away. Luis wanted to grab him, shake him, demand he do more, but he knew frontier medicine had its limits. Sarah Chen's mother brought chicken soup and herbal teas, hovering anxiously in the doorway. "She saved my Sarah," the woman whispered. "If there's anything we can do." But there was nothing anyone could do except wait and pray. Luis found himself talking constantly to Miriam, telling her about the weather, the animals, anything to keep her tethered to this world. When words failed him, he would just hold her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her work-worn palm. "Remember when you first came here?" he said one night, his voice rough with fatigue. "How you turned this shack into a real home? I never thanked you proper for that." He swallowed hard. "I need you to keep fighting, Miriam. This place ain't home without you." The coyotes would howl in the distance, and Luis would think of all the nights they'd sat together by the fire, her German hymns mixing with the wild songs outside. Now the cabin felt too quiet, despite the harsh sound of her breathing. On the third night, her fever spiked dangerously high. Luis worked frantically to cool her, stripping the blankets away and bathing her face and neck with cold water. "Stay with me," he pleaded. "Please stay with me." Around midnight, she began muttering in German, calling out to people Luis didn't know. He recognized only a few words: mother, father, home. Her hands plucked restlessly at the sheets, and tears leaked from the corners of her closed eyes. Luis caught her searching fingers in his own. "I'm here," he said hoarsely. "I'm right here, Miriam." Just before dawn, when the sky was still ink-dark and star-studded, Miriam's eyes fluttered open. They were glazed with fever, but somehow clear. Her lips moved, and Louise had to lean close to hear her whispered words. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," she breathed, "I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Louise's throat tightened. He squeezed her hand gently. "That's right, he's with you, and so am I." A ghost of a smile touched her lips before she drifted back to sleep, but her breathing seemed a little easier, and when Louise felt her forehead, the burning heat had lessened slightly. The sun rose golden over the mountains, painting the cabin walls with light. Louise dozed in his chair, still holding Miriam's hand. He woke to feel her fingers twitching against his. "Water?" she whispered. He helped her drink, his heart leaping at how she swallowed more strongly than before. Her fever had dropped further, and though she was still terribly weak, some color had returned to her cheeks. Throughout that day, Miriam drifted in and out of sleep, but each time she woke, she seemed more present. By evening, she was able to take a little broth, and her breathing, while still labored, had lost its desperate quality. "The railroad men," she said suddenly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Did they?" "Don't worry about that now," Louise cut in. "Just rest and get strong." But Miriam's face set in familiar, stubborn lines. "We cannot give up the land." "We won't," he promised, though he had no idea how to fight against the railway company's power. "But you need to heal first." Several more days passed as Miriam slowly regained her strength. She graduated from lying flat to sitting propped against pillows, though even that small effort left her exhausted. Louise brought her soup and tea, read to her from her German Bible, and told her about the neighbors who kept stopping by with food and concerned questions about her health. "They care more than they show," Miriam said softly. "God works in all hearts, even those that seem closed." One evening, about a week after the attack, Miriam was sitting up in bed, some of her old determination gleaming in her eyes. "Louise," she said, "I need you to fetch something from my trunk." He opened the heavy wooden chest that held her few possessions from her former life. The familiar scents of lavender and cedar wafted up. "There's a packet," she directed, wrapped in oilcloth tucked in the very bottom corner. Louise found it beneath carefully folded dresses and linens. The packet was old but well preserved, sealed with wax and tied with faded ribbon. Miriam's hands trembled slightly as she took it from him. "This was my husband's," she explained. "His grandfather was one of the first settlers in this valley. He purchased the land directly from the territory government, before Colorado was even a state." She broke the seal and carefully unfolded several sheets of yellowed paper. Louise leaned closer, squinting at the elaborate handwriting. "It's the original land deed," Miriam said. "Not just for our piece, but for most of the valley. The railway's survey maps are wrong. They're based on newer boundaries that were never legally registered." Louise stared at her, then back at the documents. "You mean, this deed proves the railway has no right to seize any land here without proper negotiation and payment?" A hint of color touched her pale cheeks. "I should have shown you sooner, but I wasn't sure I could trust anyone after being cast out by my own people." Louise sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his mind spinning. "This could stop them," he said slowly. "This could protect not just us, but all our neighbors." Miriam nodded. "God provides even when we cannot see the way forward." She touched the papers gently. "My husband's family may have rejected me, but they cannot reject the truth of these documents." Louise looked at his wife, this strong, faithful woman who had endured mockery, violence, and near death, yet still thought of helping others. Something swelled in his chest that felt like pride and love, and maybe even a touch of the faith she had never lost. "Rest now," he said, carefully returning the precious papers to their wrapping. "Tomorrow we'll start planning how to use these properly." Miriam settled back against her pillows, her eyes already growing heavy, but she caught his hand before he could move away. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For staying, for believing, for helping me build a true home here." Louise bent and kissed her forehead, feeling the last traces of fever had finally faded. "No," he said softly. "Thank you for teaching me what home really means." Outside, the evening wind stirred the scorched remains of Miriam's garden, but new green shoots were already pushing through the blackened earth, proving that life and hope could survive even the hottest fires. The morning sun cast long shadows across the trail as Luis guided his horse toward town. He'd left Miriam resting, still weak but recovering steadily. The precious land deed was folded carefully in his vest pocket, close to his heart. Each hoofbeat seemed to echo with purpose, driving him forward with renewed determination. The town stirred to life as he approached, shopkeepers sweeping porches, ranch hands leading horses to water troughs, women carrying baskets to market. Luis noticed how some folks stepped aside as he passed, while others watched with curious eyes. His reputation as the mountain man who'd married the Amish widow still preceded him, but there was something different in their gazes now. Outside the county clerk's office, several railwaymen lounged against the hitching post, smoking and talking in loud voices. They fell silent as Luis dismounted, their eyes narrowing. He recognized the thugs who'd burned his barn among them, but he kept his face carefully neutral as he climbed the wooden steps. Inside, the clerk's office smelled of dust and old paper. Morning light filtered through grimy windows, catching motes in its beams. The clerk, Mr. Whitaker, peered at Luis over wire-rimmed spectacles, his thin face pinched with displeasure. "Mr. Cade," he said stiffly, "what brings you to my office today?" Luis removed his hat and withdrew the oilcloth packet. "Got some documents need examining, Mr. Whitaker, regarding land rights in Cedar Valley." The clerk's frown deepened as Luis carefully unwrapped the yellowed papers. Outside, voices grew louder as more railwaymen gathered, drawn by some sixth sense that their plans might be threatened. "These here are the original territorial deeds," Luis explained, laying them on the desk. "Signed and registered before Colorado gained statehood. Show the true boundaries of all the valley properties." Whitaker's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the document. He adjusted his spectacles, squinting at the elaborate script. Luis stood silent, watching as the clerk's expression shifted from dismissal to confusion to grudging recognition. "These appear to be genuine territorial documents," Whitaker admitted finally. "But surely the railway's current surveys are based on incorrect boundaries," Luis finished quietly. "These papers prove it. The railway has no legal right to seize our land without proper negotiation and payment." The clerk's mouth worked soundlessly as he compared the old deed to newer maps spread across his desk. The difference was clear. The railway's surveys had conveniently adjusted property lines to suit their purposes, counting on no one having proof of the original boundaries. A shadow darkened the doorway. The railway's head surveyor, Jackson, stood there with two of his men. "What's this about incorrect boundaries?" he demanded. Whitaker cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Cade has produced original territorial deeds that contradict your current survey maps." Jackson stalked forward, snatching at the papers, but Luis smoothly intercepted his hand. "Careful now," Luis said softly. "Those are legal documents being reviewed by the county clerk." The surveyor's face reddened. "You think some moldy old papers can stop progress? The railway's coming through one way or another." "Not without proper compensation," Luis replied. "Not without respecting the law." More townspeople were gathering outside now, drawn by the raised voices. Through the window, Luis could see them clustering on the street, heads together in whispered conversation. Whitaker rose from his desk, straightening his vest. "These deeds are legitimate," he announced, his voice gaining strength. "They establish clear property lines that predate any railway claims. By territorial law, these boundaries must be honored, untout." Jackson slammed his fist on the desk, making the clerk jump. "This is ridiculous. We have government backing. You have permissions based on incorrect surveys," Whitaker cut in, surprising everyone with his firmness. "These documents prove the original property lines. If you want to build through Cedar Valley, you'll need to negotiate fairly with the legal landowners." A murmur rose from the crowd outside. Several faces pressed against the office windows, straining to hear. Luis noticed old Sam Turner, whose family had farmed in the valley for 3 generations, nodding in approval. "I'll have my lawyers review this," Jackson spat, jabbing a finger at Luis. "Don't think you've won anything, mountain man. The railway doesn't take kindly to interference." "Ain't about winning," Luis replied calmly. "It's about what's right. These deeds protect everyone in the valley, not just me and mine." The surveyor stormed out, shouldering through the gathering crowd. His men followed. but Luis noticed how some of them couldn't meet his eyes. Perhaps they'd begun to question the justice of burning out honest farmers for corporate profit. Whitaker carefully copied the deed information into his registry, his pen scratching in the sudden quiet. "I'll file these officially," he said. "The railway can't legally proceed without new negotiations now." Outside, the crowd had grown larger. As Luis emerged from the office, he heard scattered applause. Old Sam Turner stepped forward, extending his hand. "You done right by all of us," the farmer said gruffly. "That railway thought they could just roll over whoever they pleased." Others pressed forward to shake Luis's hand or clap his shoulder. Even some who'd once mocked his marriage to Miriam now offered quiet words of thanks. But not everyone was pleased. Luis noticed several merchants muttering darkly about delayed progress and lost opportunities. Reverend Matthews pushed through the crowd, his face serious. "This may protect our lands," he said, "but it's also made powerful enemies. The railway won't give up easily." "No," Luis agreed, "but they'll have to deal fair now, that's all we're asking." The sun was lowering toward the mountains as Luis mounted his horse for the ride home. He heard fragments of conversation as he rode past the gathering crowds. "Bound to slow things down. Could have made good money selling Outlander. Better this way, keeping our independence, man. That Amish woman must have known all along." The last comment made Luis smile slightly. Miriam had indeed known, but she'd waited until she was sure of their trust in each other before sharing the deed's existence. Her wisdom still amazed him. The trail home seemed shorter than usual, his heart lighter despite the challenges ahead. He found Miriam sitting in her rocking chair on the porch, wrapped in a quilt against the evening chill. Her face brightened at his approach. "The deed?" she asked as he dismounted. "Clerk confirmed it's legal. Railway can't take any land without proper negotiation now." He settled beside her, stretching his legs. "Some folks are mighty thankful. Others, not so much." Miriam nodded thoughtfully. "There will be hard feelings, the railway men especially. They lost face today." "Reckon they might try something else," Luis admitted. "But we've got the law on our side now." "The law is important," Miriam said softly, "but so is mercy. We mustn't let victory make us proud or vengeful." Luis thought of Jackson's angry face, the threats barely hidden in his words. It would be easy to feel triumphant, to want revenge for their burned barn and Miriam's injury. But her quiet wisdom cut through those darker impulses. "You're right," he said, taking her hand. "Justice without mercy ain't much better than no justice at all." They sat together as dusk settled over the valley, painting the scorched earth in gentle colors. New grass was already sprouting where the barn had stood, and Miriam's trampled garden showed fresh green shoots pushing through the soil. Like the land itself, they would heal and grow stronger, not through vengeance but through patient cultivation of what was good. The evening wind carried the sound of coyotes singing in the hills, their wild voices weaving together in ancient harmony. Luis felt Miriam's hand warm in his, and thought about how far they'd come from that first day at the auction square. They'd faced mockery, violence, and near death, but their bond had only grown stronger. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "We rebuild," Miriam answered. "We help our neighbors heal. We show that there's a better way than fighting force with force." Luis nodded, humbled by her generous spirit. Even after all she'd suffered, she still chose mercy over vengeance, faith over fear. The railway men might see this as a defeat, but Miriam understood it was really a chance for something better, a way to build bridges instead of burning them. As the first stars appeared above the mountains, Luis silently thanked God for bringing this remarkable woman into his life. Together, they would face whatever challenges came next, grounded in justice, but guided by mercy. The first autumn winds swept down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and early snow. Luis watched from the cabin door as golden leaves scattered across their newly replanted garden. Inside, Miriam's cough echoed against the log walls, a sound that made his heart clench every time he heard it. She stood at the stove, stirring a pot of chicken broth for the McNally children, whose mother lay sick with fever 2 farms over. The steam rose around her face, and Luis noticed how her cheeks had grown hollow these past weeks. "Let me finish that," he said, moving to take the wooden spoon from her hand. Miriam shook her head stubbornly. "I can manage a pot of soup, Luis." but her words ended in another harsh cough that left her gripping the counter for support. Luis guided her firmly to her rocking chair by the fire. "You need rest." He tucked a quilt around her shoulders, noting how she didn't resist as much as she would have even a week ago. When her breathing steadied, she looked up at him with tired eyes. "The smoke did more harm than I first thought," she admitted quietly. "My lungs, they don't seem to be healing right." The confession struck Luis like a physical blow. He'd suspected as much watching her struggle these past months, but hearing her say it made it real. He knelt beside her chair, taking her work-worn hands in his. "Then you'll rest more," he said. "I can manage things." A ghost of her usual smile touched her lips. "You already do so much." It was true. Since the railway men's attack, Luis had taken on most of the heavy work. He rose before dawn to milk their cow, tend the animals, and work their reduced garden plot. The hours between chores he spent cutting and stacking firewood, knowing winter would come harsh to their mountain valley. But it wasn't enough. Not when he rode into town for supplies and heard the whispered threats. Just yesterday, outside the general store, he'd overheard Gabe Turner, the merchant's son, talking with the railway surveyor, Jackson. Their words carried clearly in the crisp autumn air. "Won't take much," Turner had said. "That Amish woman's already failing. Come winter, they won't be able to work the land proper. They'll have to sell." Jackson's reply was thick with satisfaction. "Might not even take that long. Amazing how hard it gets to buy supplies when merchants don't want to sell." Luis had gripped his saddle horn until his knuckles went white, fighting the urge to confront them. But Miriam's voice echoed in his memory. Violence only breeds more violence. Instead, he'd channeled his anger into action. On his ride home, he'd stopped at every friendly farm, trading labor for surplus supplies. Old Sam Turner, no relation to Gabe, had promised him extra grain. The widow McNally offered preserved vegetables in exchange for help with her roof. Now, watching Miriam rock slowly by the fire, Luis mentally calculated their stores. They had enough dried beans and corn to last months, thanks to her careful planning. The root cellar was half full of potatoes and squash. He'd smoke more meat tomorrow, and there were still deer in the woods if needed. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Sarah McNally, the oldest of the widow's children, stood there with tears in her eyes. "Ma's worse," she said, "and Tommy's starting to burn up too." Miriam was already struggling to rise from her chair. Luis put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'll fetch what's needed from your herb chest," he said. "You tell me what to do." But Miriam shook her head. Children need a mother's touch when they're sick. She looked up at Sarah. "Bring Tommy here, dear. He can stay in the spare room where it's warm." Luis wanted to protest. Caring for a sick child would tax Miriam's fragile strength. But he saw the determination in her face and knew this was part of who she was, this giving of herself to others. Within hours, their quiet cabin had transformed. Tommy McNally tossed in the spare bed while Miriam bathed his forehead with cool cloths. His two younger sisters huddled by the fire, watching with wide eyes as Luis showed them how to whittle simple toys from pine scraps. That night after the children had finally slept, Luis found Miriam swaying on her feet as she gathered fresh herbs for a poultice. "Enough," he said firmly, catching her elbow. "You need rest too." She started to protest, but another coughing fit doubled her over. When it passed, she allowed him to help her to bed. "I don't know how to heal like you do," Luis said, drawing the blankets up, "but I know how to protect what matters. Let me do that." Miriam's hand found his in the darkness. "You already do more than you know." The next morning, Luis rose early to reinforce their fences before the winter storms hit. The railway men might be held off legally, but he didn't trust them not to try other methods of pressure. As he worked, he kept one eye on the cabin, watching smoke rise steadily from the chimney where Miriam tended her patient. Sarah McNally appeared at his side, offering to help hold boards while he hammered. Her small face was serious as she worked. "Pa died when I was little," she said suddenly. "But I remember he used to say a man's worth shows in how he protects them that need it." Luis paused, studying the girl's earnest expression. "Your pa was a wise man." "That's why we trust you and Miss Miriam," Sarah continued, "even though some folks in town say mean things. Ma says you two show God's love by your actions, not just words." The simple faith in her voice humbled him. He'd spent so many years alone, believing he needed nothing and no one. Now, he had not just Miriam to protect, but a growing circle of people who counted on them both. That evening, more children arrived at their door. The Cooper twins, whose parents were both down with fever. Miriam's face lit up at the sight of them, though Louise could hear the wheeze in her breathing as she helped them settle in. "We can't turn them away," she said later when Louise worried about the strain on her health. "They have nowhere else to go." He nodded, understanding that this was not just kindness but a deep calling in her heart. So he split more wood to keep the cabin warm, hung extra blankets to create private spaces, and taught the older children to help with simple chores. Days passed in a blur of activity. Luis rose before dawn to care for their animals and those of their sick neighbors. He rode fence lines, repaired storm damage, and gathered the last hardy vegetables from their garden. In between, he helped Miriam tend their young charges, learning from her how to check for fever and when to give which medicines. The cabin rang with children's voices now, somewhat subdued by worry for their parents, but still carrying that irrepressible spark of youth. Luis found himself telling stories during the long evenings, tales of his trapping days cleaned up for young ears. Even Miriam smiled more, though her cough grew worse as the air turned colder. But he didn't miss how she had to rest more often, how each coughing spell left her more drained than the last. At night, he lay awake listening to her labored breathing, sending up awkward prayers to a God he was only beginning to trust again. The weather turned sharply colder, and the first snow dusted the mountain peaks. Luis doubled his efforts to prepare for winter, knowing that soon the passes would be difficult to traverse. He traded his labor for extra supplies whenever possible, building up their stores against the threats from town. One evening, he returned from helping the widow McNally to find Miriam teaching the Cooper twins to knit by firelight. She looked up as he entered, and in her tired smile he saw everything that needed protecting. Not just her physical safety, but this gentle spirit that gave so freely despite her own weakness. "I reckon we're ready for whatever winter brings," he said, settling beside her chair with a cup of coffee. "Fences are strong, stores are full, and there's more firewood than we can use in 3 months." Miriam reached over to squeeze his hand. "God will provide," she said softly. "He already has, through you." Luis watched the children absorbed in their knitting lessons, listened to Tommy McNally's improving cough from the back room, felt Miriam's warm hand in his. He'd thought he was meant to be just her protector, but somehow she'd shown him a bigger purpose, creating a haven not just for themselves but for all who needed one. Outside, the wind sang through pine boughs and rattled the newly reinforced shutters, but inside their cabin, the fire crackled warmly, and the children's quiet chatter filled the air with hope. Whatever threats winter might bring, from nature or from men, they would face them together, with strength built not from weapons or walls, but from mercy freely given. The snow fell thick and heavy across the valley, transforming their mountain home into a white fortress. Inside the cabin, Miriam stretched their dwindling food stores as best she could, making thin but nourishing soups to feed the children who still sheltered with them. Luis watched her careful portioning with concern, noting how she gave up her own share more often than not. The little ones need it more, she would say whenever he protested, though her cough had grown worse in the bitter cold. Late one night, urgent pounding startled them awake. Luis grabbed his rifle, but Miriam laid a steadying hand on his arm. At their door stood Thomas Burke and his wife Mary, the same couple who had laughed loudest at their wedding. Now their faces were drawn with fear. "Please," Mary sobbed. "The influenza's taken half the town. Our Emma's burning up and Dr. Wells is down sick himself. They say you know healing ways." Luis felt his jaw tighten, remembering their cruel jokes, but Miriam was already reaching for her shawl, moving to her herb chest with practiced hands. "Bring Emma here," she said softly, "and spread word any who need help can come." Through the night, Miriam mixed honey and herbs for burning throats, showed worried parents how to break fevers with cool cloths. Her own cough punctuated her quiet instructions, but she didn't stop. Even those who had scorned them most bitterly found welcome at their door. When Luis questioned her later, she smiled tiredly. "The Lord gave us bread for sharing, not hoarding," she reminded him. "Their past unkindness doesn't change what's right." In the lamplight, Luis saw both exhaustion and peace in her face. Her mercy was changing more than just their neighbors' minds. It was changing his heart, too. The winter winds began to soften, and with them came an unexpected thaw in the townspeople's hearts. Families who had once turned away in scorn now appeared at their cabin door, arms laden with gifts of gratitude. Sarah Miller brought a carefully stitched quilt, her eyes downcast as she recalled her harsh words months before. The Cooper boys carried fresh venison, remembering how Miriam had tended their fever through 3 sleepless nights. Just a small thank you, they'd mumble, but Miriam welcomed each one with the same gentle smile. On Sunday morning, Preacher Whitfield's voice rang clear through the wooden church. "We've witnessed true Christian charity in our midst," he declared, nodding toward Miriam. "The Lord works through humble vessels, showing us the power of mercy freely given." Luis stood tall beside his wife, feeling the weight of changed gazes upon them. Where there had once been sneers, he now saw respect in their neighbors' eyes. Even Mr. Harrison, the railroad's main supporter, touched his hat when they passed. The final proof came in an official letter. The railroad company, facing mounting local resistance and confronted with the ironclad deed, had abandoned their plans for the valley. Their home was safe at last, protected not just by law, but by the very community that had once scorned them. The mountain winter began to release its grip on the valley. Fresh snow glittered like diamonds under a bright morning sun, and the air rang with children's laughter. 6 young ones from the Thompson and Miller families rolled snowballs near the cabin, their woolen scarves trailing behind them as they worked. "Look, Mr. Cade," little Sarah called out, pointing to a crooked snowman with a carrot nose. "We made him smile just like Mrs. Miriam." Luis paused in his work, a hammer held steady in his calloused hand. Through the barn's open doorway, he watched the children play. Beside him, John Cooper and Frank Miller steadied a new beam, their shared labor-healing old wounds. The barn's charred walls were slowly giving way to fresh timber, each plank a testament to newfound friendship. From the cabin's open door drifted the sound of Miriam's clear voice singing Amazing Grace in German while she stirred a pot of vegetable soup. Her thick shawl wrapped tight against the cold, she smiled at the scene before her. Steam rose from the cooking pot like prayers of thanksgiving. The cabin, its walls still bearing scorch marks from that terrible night, now stood as more than just a home. It had become a beacon of hope, where hungry souls found bread, sick children found healing, and lonely hearts found welcome. April sunshine warmed the mountain valley, painting the slopes in tender green. Fresh grass pushed through melting snow, and wild iris dotted the meadows with purple promise. Along the garden paths, Luis walked with careful steps, his arm wrapped protectively around Miriam's waist. Though winter's illness had left her thinner, her eyes shone with quiet joy. "The Lord makes all things new," Miriam whispered, pausing to catch her breath. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched a budding apple tree. Children's voices rang out from the trail. Jenny Wilson and the Cooper twins came running, their arms full of wildflowers. "Mrs. Miriam, we picked these special." They crowded around her, filling her waiting basket with bluebells and Indian paintbrush. That evening, as sunset painted the cabin windows gold, Luis and Miriam sat at their table. The lamp cast warm shadows as they bowed their heads. Their voices rose together in "Abide with me," his deep bass supporting her sweet alto. Luis looked at his wife, remembering that dusty auction square where townsfolk had laughed. Now he saw only beauty, God's grace made flesh. Outside, children's laughter echoed across the valley. Their home, once a target of cruel jokes, now stood as a beacon of mercy, its doors open to all who sought shelter. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.